He was an orphan boy who spoke to no one. His only obsession was collecting trash from the street. A button, a broken key, an old note. A symptom of his trauma? To psychologists, yes, but not to the old street sweeper from Liverpool. He knew it wasn't trash. It was a map. I think you'll be thrilled to discover that this map, made from discarded objects, contained the only clue to the secret of your mother's disappearance. Please watch the full video to understand this incredible journey. And of course, before continuing, subscribe to the channel. Like it and tell us in the comments where you are following us from. The morning mist that rises from the River Mersey, even on the clearest mornings, carries with it the smell of salt, damp brick, and Liverpool's industrial history. For Arthur, a man in his 70s whose back was bent from decades of work, this was the scent of home. It was the scent that had accompanied him every morning for more than 30 years as he pushed his thick bristled broom along the pavements and cobblestones near the docks. His work began before the city had truly woken, in the silence that was broken only by the solitary cry of a seagull or the distant whistle of a ship. Arthur was not just a street sweeper. He was the unseen curator of the sleeping city, the first to witness the stories that the previous night had left behind, written in the small detritus that he swept away with a quiet, methodical dignity. He was a part of the landscape as constant as the tide. What set Arthur apart from any other street sweeper was his memory. He had a vast and meticulous mental archive of the city's small discarded objects. He could not easily recall the faces of tourists, but he remembered perfectly the type of wrapping paper from a sweet shop that had closed 20 years ago. He knew that the cigarette butts left near the dockyard gate were of a cheap brand, while those found near the luxury hotels were long and thin. He saw the ebb and flow of the city's life through its rubbish. To him, a lost button was not just a button. It was the fragment of a sailor's coat in a hurry. A torn cinema ticket was not rubbish. It was the ghost of a romantic encounter. This skill, useless to the world, was his secret, his way of reading the unwritten chronicles of Liverpool. It was because of this skill that he had noticed Alfie. The orphanage, an austere red brick Victorian building overlooking the square that Arthur cleaned, was a place of constant flux. Children came and went. But Alfie was different. Since his arrival a few months ago, the 7-year-old had been an island of silence. Arthur saw him every morning, sitting on the front steps, wearing a coat that seemed a little too big for him. His big brown eyes did not focus on people or the passing double-decker buses. They were always fixed on the ground, sweeping the cracks in the paving stones, the gutters, the base of the fences with a concentration that bordered on obsession. He was not simply looking, he was hunting. The first time Arthur witnessed Alfie's hunt in action, the boy stood up suddenly, his small body moving with silent urgency. He crossed the street, his gaze fixed on the ground near where a group of street musicians used to play, near the Cavern Quarter. He bent down and with his slender, precise fingers picked up something tiny and colorful. He held it in his palm for a moment, examining it in the pale morning light as if it were a diamond. Then, with the care of someone guarding a relic, he put it in his pocket and returned to his post on the steps. Arthur, sweeping the sidewalk opposite, recognized the object. It was a guitar pick, a particular kind, with the logo of a local band from the 60s. It was a piece of nostalgia, a fragment of the city's musical soul, and the way the boy had held it told Arthur that this was no random find. Inside the orphanage, Alfie's small room was a world unto itself, a sanctuary of order and silence. His bed was always perfectly made, and the few toys he had been given sat untouched on the shelf, gathering dust. The real heart of his universe was on the floor. There, on the cold linoleum floor, he created his patterns. The vintage guitar pick was carefully placed next to a faded Merseyrail train ticket and an old bent brass key. Beside them lay a playing card, the Jack of Hearts, its edges worn away. This was no child's mess. There was a visual syntax to it, a secret grammar. The objects were arranged in a precise line, almost a timeline, each separated by a precise space. The specialist who visited him saw only pathology. A young psychologist with good intentions and a manual full of theories tried for weeks to get him to engage in structured play. She would sit on the floor with Alfie, trying to get him to build a tower with blocks or draw a house with crayons. But Alfie remained indifferent, his gaze fixed on his collection. In the psychologist's report, words like obsessive-compulsive behavior, and fixation on inanimate objects as a response to trauma were prominent. She saw the collection as the problem, a manifestation of the boy's inner disorder. She could not conceive that the collection was not the disorder. It was the only order left. For Alfie, these objects were portals. The words had drowned in a sea of fear and confusion on the day everything changed. But the objects, they remembered. When he held the guitar pick, he didn't just feel the smooth plastic. He heard the echo of a Beatles song played by a street musician, smelled the crisps in the air, and felt the warmth of his mother Eleanor's hand holding his tightly. The train ticket wasn't just paper. It was the rhythmic sound of the wheels on the tracks, the vibration beneath his feet, the sight of the Mersey water glistening outside the window. Each item was an anchor, a portal to a specific moment in a day that he refused to forget. He wasn't collecting junk. He was desperately salvaging the fragments of his last happy day from the shipwreck of memory. The orphanage's carers, kind women who were exhausted by the routine of caring for 20 children, saw Alfie's collection as a practical problem. It was street clutter, they said. It was unsanitary. With the best of intentions, they tried to clean his room. "Alfie, darling, let's get rid of these old things. Look at this brand new fire engine we have for you." One of them once tried to sweep the objects away with a shovel. Alfie's reaction was terrifying in its stillness. He did not cry or scream. His whole body began to shake uncontrollably, his eyes wide in silent panic like a cornered animal. The carer, frightened, backed away. She did not understand that she was not cleaning a room. She was trying to demolish the only home the boy's memory could still inhabit. The day of Arthur's epiphany began as a typical Liverpool Saturday. Gray with a light drizzle that left the pavements shiny. The Albert Dock area was full of life despite the weather. Tourists in raincoats, families strolling, the sound of music coming from the bars and the smell of fish and chips in the air. It was a day of vibrant energy, the kind of day that would normally overwhelm a boy like Alfie. And indeed, he was there, with one of the younger caretakers, sitting on a bench a little away from the crowd. But he didn't seem overwhelmed. He seemed focused, his eyes scanning the stone floor with the intensity of a predator, searching for something specific amid the chaos of feet and shadows. Arthur, meanwhile, was at the end of his shift. His work on Saturdays was harder. The amount of trash left by the crowd was much greater. He pushed his cart with his usual efficiency, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. He saw Alfie from afar, a small figure of stillness amidst the hustle and bustle. He felt the usual pang of sadness for the boy. And then he saw Alfie's posture change. The boy's body tensed, leaning forward, his eyes fixed on something. He was in hunting mode. And Arthur, by a premonition he could not explain, stopped sweeping and began to observe. That was when the first piece of the puzzle fell into place. Not far from Alfie, a street musician was playing a Beatles cover on a battered acoustic guitar. A tourist dropped some coins into his open case, and as he did so, the pick that had been stuck between the strings of the guitar fell to the ground. It was a blue pick, with the same faded logo of the band from the 60s. Arthur recognized it instantly, and he saw Alfie's eyes follow it like a hawk following its prey. He saw the boy stand up, walk with silent determination, pick up the pick and return to his stool, the object now firmly in his hand. It was not just any pick. It was the pick from this place. The second piece came moments later. A group of teenagers, laughing and talking loudly, ran past. One of them, pulling his mobile phone out of his pocket, dropped a paper ticket. It was a Merseyrail train ticket. The wind carried it a few meters until it came to rest near a lamppost. Alfie saw it. Once again, he got up, walked over to the ticket, picked it up, and examined it. Arthur, from his position, could see the line printed on the ticket. Wirral. Line. The route that led to New Brighton across the river. The town with its old pier and its amusement park. And Arthur remembered the other train ticket he had seen in Alfie's collection. They were for the same line. Arthur stopped sweeping. He leaned his broom against a wall and stood completely still, his brain working at high speed, connecting dots that had been separated by weeks and months. His photographic memory began to flash images in his mind. The mother of pearl button he had seen months ago. He remembered it had belonged to the jacket of an old sailor who sang sea shanties on New Brighton Pier. The bent brass key. It was the kind used in the old lockers at the train station there. The playing card, the Jack of Hearts, had belonged to a street magician who performed on the park promenade. The objects were not random. They were specific. They were souvenirs. The epiphany hit Arthur with the force of a Mersey wave. He looked at the boy sitting on the bench. now arranging his two new treasures in his hands. Alfie was not collecting rubbish. He was reconstructing a day, a specific, perfect day, a day that had begun with Beatles music near the Cavern Club, continued with a train journey to New Brighton, a visit to the park, the pier, a magician, a sailor. The mosaic on the floor of his room was not a symptom. It was a map of memories, a map of the last happy day he had spent with his mother, Eleanor, before something terrible happened and she disappeared from his life. A wave of wonder and overwhelming sadness washed over Arthur. The genius and pain contained in that small, silent project were immense. He, the old street sweeper with his useless knowledge of the city's trash, was the only person in the world who could read that map. The psychologists, with all their science, saw only the mess of trauma. The caregivers, with all their kindness, saw only the dirt of the street. But he, with his useless knowledge of the city's detritus, saw the language of love. He saw a son's desperate attempt to keep his mother's memory from turning to dust, like the ones he swept up every day. And with that realization came a crushing weight of responsibility. He could no longer be an observer on this lonely journey. He knew he couldn't just walk up to Alfie and say, "I understand what you're doing." Words would break the spell. Words belonged to the world that had failed the boy, the world that tried to impose its logic on his silence. If he wanted to help, he would have to enter Alfie's world. He would have to speak his language, the language of found objects. The idea of intervening was terrifying. He was just the sweeper. Who was he to meddle in the life of a child in the care of the system? He might lose his job, the routine that had kept him afloat since his own wife died years ago. He might be seen as a dangerous old man. But then he looked at Alfie's face. He saw the fierce determination in the way the boy held his treasures. He saw the loneliness in his small shoulders, and he made up his mind. The risk to his quiet life was nothing compared to the risk of letting this silent story die unheard. He could not be just a spectator. He owed it to Alfie and to Eleanor's memory to become a participant. He would become a secret partner in this treasure hunt, a guardian angel disguised as a street sweeper. The decision once made filled his old heart with a sense of purpose he had not felt in years. His broom would not just sweep the streets, it would help clear the path to a boy's healing. Planning began immediately in Arthur's mind. He needed to become part of the synchronicity. He needed to plant the next piece of the map. He spent the rest of his shift not just sweeping, but thinking. What would be the next logical step in Eleanor and Alfie's journey? Music in the town center, a train ride to New Brighton. What next? The fairground. And what was the most iconic image of the old New Brighton Park? The carousel. The big old carousel with its hand-painted wooden horses, and its nostalgic music echoing across the pier. And to ride the carousel, you needed a token, a specific brass token. That evening, in his small flat overlooking the rooftops of Liverpool, Arthur opened an old biscuit tin. Inside was his own collection of treasures found over 50 years of work. He rummaged through the box with trembling fingers, his heart filled with nervous hope. And then he found it. Small, worn, and the color of old gold. A brass token from the New Brighton carousel, embossed with a picture of a horse. He had found it perhaps 10 years ago, forgotten near a bench. Then it had been just an interesting object. Now it was a word. It was the next sentence in his silent conversation with Alfie. The next morning arrived with the same cold mist as ever. But to Arthur, the world seemed different. He could feel the weight of the brass token in his coat pocket. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a responsibility, a promise. He had arrived on his route early, when the streets were still empty and the silence was total. He needed Alfie's find to seem completely accidental, a gift from the town, a small miracle. The authenticity of the discovery was crucial for the game to work, for trust to be established. The operation required the care and precision of a watchmaker. He waited until Alfie had come out and sat down in his usual spot on the steps of the orphanage. Like an actor on a stage known only to him, Arthur began his sweeping routine, moving in a slow, familiar pattern that would take him closer to the steps. When he was a safe distance away but clearly in the boy's line of sight, he pretended that his broom had gotten caught on something. He crouched down, muttering to himself about the rubbish people left behind, and picked up the token from the ground, which he had actually taken out of his pocket. He examined it with an expression of mild annoyance, as if it were just another piece of metal rubbish. Then with a careless gesture, instead of tossing it into his trolley, He tossed it to the side, where it bounced across the stones and came to rest near a flower bed. Arthur walked away, his heart in his throat. He continued to sweep across the square, but every fiber of his being was tuned to the boy on the steps. He heard the pause in the sound of his own broom. He glanced over his shoulder. Alfie, after several minutes of motionless watching, had come down the steps. He walked slowly, almost hesitantly, to the flower bed. He crouched down. Arthur saw the small hand reach out and pick up the brass token. He saw Alfie examine it, turning it over in the dim morning light. And he saw, even from a distance, a flicker of pure recognition in the boy's eyes, a spark of rekindled memory. The first message had been delivered, and, more important, it had been understood. The silent partnership had begun. For Alfie, the brass token in his palm was not just an object. It was a symphony of forgotten sensations. As he touched it, the smell of salt air and cotton candy, along with the sound of the merry-go-round music, flooded his mind. He could feel the rhythmic movement of the painted wooden horse rising and falling, the wind in his face, and most importantly, he could hear his mother Eleanor's laughter, a sound he feared he had forgotten forever. The token was not just a piece of metal. It was the key that unlocked the door to that moment of pure joy. Back in his room, he carefully placed it on the floor, behind the guitar pick and the train ticket. The map of his memory was growing. Across the street, Arthur felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. He was no longer just the man who cleaned up after others. He was a cartographer of memory, a silent partner in the most important quest of a boy's life. That night in his modest apartment, he didn't think about the weariness of his aging body. His mind was focused on the map. What would come after the amusement park? What would be the next step in Alfie and Eleanor's journey? He needed to be the guide that fate, or perhaps Eleanor herself, from heaven, was asking him to be. He spent the next night awake, searching through his memories of the town. What would a mother and son do after a stroll through New Brighton? Maybe a sweet treat. He remembered the stalls selling rock candy, the hard, striped sweet with the town's name written in the middle, a classic souvenir of any British seaside stroll. The next day he found what he was looking for, a small broken piece of rock candy, discarded by a tourist near the docks. The word Brighton was still faintly legible in the center. It was perfect. It was the next piece of the map. With the care of a spy, he left it near a bench in the square, and Alfie found it. The next day, his morning search seemed to have a new focus. He was no longer just looking, he was waiting for a sign. When he saw the small piece of colorful candy, he approached it with less hesitation. He picked it up, brought it to his nose, and took a deep breath. The smell of sugar and mint was another trigger. He remembered his mother buying one for him, the sticky texture on his fingers, the sweet taste on his tongue. He went back to his room and placed the piece of candy next to the carousel token. The map now had a smell, a taste. The journey of that happy day was becoming more and more real, rescued from oblivion. Inside the orphanage, a subtle change in Alfie was noticeable. He remained silent, but the aura of desperation around him seemed to have lessened. There was a sparkle in his eyes, a focused energy that the caregivers had never seen before. They had watched him spend hours arranging his treasures on the floor, but now they began to see it as a game. "He seems calmer," one of the caregivers told the director. "He spends all day focused on his project. Maybe it's a form of therapy he's created for himself." They couldn't have been closer to the truth, but they had no way of knowing the depth of that therapy, or that it had an unexpected accomplice across the square. Alfie's map of objects now stretched from the Cavern Club grounds, past an imaginary Merseyrail line, and into New Brighton. Arthur knew the next step was crucial. He needed a deeper clue, something that would point to Eleanor's personality. He remembered the news reports from the time of her disappearance. The papers had mentioned that she was a textile design student at Liverpool University. Her art, that was the key. The next object on the map couldn't be about a place or a food. It had to be about her passion, what defined her as an artist and a mother. Finding the next item was a challenge. In an age of electric sewing machines, anything older was a relic. But Arthur was patient. He searched charity shops and flea markets. And then, in a box of old sewing supplies, he found it. A small wooden spool, the kind used on old industrial sewing machines. It was an object most people would have ignored, but to someone who worked with fabrics, it was an icon. He bought the little spool for a few pence. This would be a more abstract test. It was not linked to a smell or a sound, but to a concept, a memory of an activity. He left the wooden spool near a flower bed. Alfie, searching for it, found it quickly. He picked it up, his brow furrowed in confusion. But then the memory came, not of the object itself, but of what it represented. The image of his mother in her small studio at university, surrounded by colorful fabrics, the rhythmic sound of the sewing machine. He remembered the smell of thread and fabric, the way she had let him play with the colorful scraps. He put the wooden spool on the map, and now the path of objects was no longer just about happy places. It was about his mother. It was about her art. It was about the way she created beauty in the world. The growing collection of objects in Alfie's room, however, began to worry the orphanage's new administrator, a woman named Mrs. Gable. She was a woman of rules and order, who saw the collection not as a therapeutic game but as an unhygienic mess and a sign that the boy was not progressing. "This has to stop," she told one of the caregivers. "He's accumulating trash. We have to set limits. Tomorrow, while he's out in the yard, we're going to do a thorough cleaning of his room. He needs to understand that the past is behind him." The decision was made with the coldness of someone who does not understand the language of the heart. Arthur, from his observation post in the square, felt a chill run down his spine. He hadn't heard the conversation, but he'd seen Mrs. Gable gesturing toward Alfie's room and then looking at the boy with a disapproving expression. He knew that look. It was the look of an adult about to fix a child, breaking him even further in the process. His instincts told him something terrible was about to happen. The map, the fragile bridge of communication that he and Alfie had been so carefully building, was in danger. A boy's only tangible connection to his mother was about to be swept into a garbage bag. Panic gripped Arthur. He had to act. He needed a distraction, something big enough to get everyone's attention and stop Mrs. Gable's plan. And then he had an idea. It was a dirty, noisy idea, but it was the only one he had. He looked at the large metal trash can that stood on the corner of the square. Heart pounding, he pushed his trash cart toward it, and with an effort that made his old muscles protest, tipped the can over. The noise was deafening, a crash of metal against stone, followed by a cascade of trash spilling onto the clean sidewalk. The commotion worked. The orphanage door flew open and Mrs. Gable came out, furious. "What the hell is this?" she shouted. As she scolded him, Arthur saw one of the younger caretakers, Chloe, come out to help. Chloe had always had a kinder eye for Alfie. As she helped to pick up the rubbish, Arthur leaned closer and whispered urgently, "Please don't let them throw Alfie's things away. It's not rubbish, it's his mother. It's a map." He planted the seed of doubt. Chloe looked at the old sweeper's earnest face, nodded subtly, and went back inside, determined to protect the boy's secret. Chloe found Mrs. Gable about to enter Alfie's room with a trash bag. "Wait," Chloe said, her voice firm. "The psychologist mentioned that any abrupt changes could be detrimental. Perhaps we should wait." The excuse gave the administrator pause. The map was safe. Later, Chloe entered Alfie's room. For the first time, she really looked at the arrangement on the floor. She saw the pick, the note, the token, the candy, and the spool. She didn't understand the story, but Arthur's words echoed in her mind. In that moment, she became the guardian of this fragile construction of memories, the second accomplice in Arthur's silent conspiracy. Arthur knew time was running out. He had to find the final piece of the map. The wooden spool was the clue. Eleanor was a textile design student. Where would she go? He remembered the old art college building in town, a place with studios that students could rent. It was a hunch, but a strong hunch. The final piece of the puzzle had to be there. The last object needed to be a symbol not of a memory, but of a destiny, a key. While cleaning near an old red mailbox, he found what he needed, a small rusty key, the kind used for small cabinets. It would be the last piece he would give to Alfie. Alfie's path. The boy found it. He held it, and his face showed not a memory but a sense of purpose. He went back to his room and placed the key at the end of the line of objects, the pick, the note, the token, the sweet, the spool, and now the key. The map was complete. He got up, went to the window of his room, which looked out over the square, and looked straight at Arthur. He didn't wave. He just looked, and his look was a clear, direct question. What now? Arthur understood. The clue phase was over. The boy was asking him to lead the way in the real world. That afternoon, Arthur waited for Chloe to emerge from the orphanage. He approached her with respectful urgency. "I think I know where the map leads," he said. "I believe the key opens a cupboard in the old art college, a place his mother used to use. Will you help me get him there?" He was asking her to break all the rules, to risk her job for an old sweeper's intuition. Chloe looked at Arthur's serious, pleading face. She thought of the look of purpose she had seen in Alfie. The decision was easy. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I'll help." The next day a plan was hatched. Chloe would say she was taking Alfie to a routine doctor's appointment. Instead, she would meet him and Arthur on the street corner. And together, the three of them, the old street sweeper, the young caretaker, and the silent boy, would follow Alfie's memory map to his final destination. The journey began. They walked through the streets of Liverpool, following the route the objects had traced. They passed the Cavern Quarter. They made their way to the Merseyrail station. It was a pilgrimage, a physical recreation of the last happy day. Arthur pointed out the landmarks, and Alfie nodded, his eyes shining with recognition. Finally, they reached the imposing old building of the Liverpool College of Art. Alfie paused in the doorway, his breath caught. He recognized the place. He tugged Chloe's hand, leading them inside. The place was a maze of corridors that smelled of paint and clay. An old caretaker, after hearing Chloe's story, remembered Eleanor. "The textile lady," he said. He led them to a forgotten corner of the textile department, where there was a row of old wooden lockers. Alfie walked straight to one of them, number 3B, and held up the rusty key. The moment of truth had arrived. Alfie's hand was shaking so badly that he could barely fit the key into the lock. Arthur, with infinite kindness, knelt beside him and placed his large, wrinkled hand over Alfie's, helping him steady himself. "Together," he whispered. Together they turned the key. The click of the lock opening echoed in the quiet hallway, a loud, final sound. The small wooden door creaked open, revealing what was inside. It was not art equipment or fabrics. It was a single, weather-beaten leather portfolio, with a thick brown envelope on top, and on the envelope, written in a neat, familiar hand, was a single word: Alfie. Chloe, her hands equally shaking, picked up the envelope. It was light, but it felt like it held the weight of a universe. She looked at Arthur, who nodded, and then at Alfie, who was watching with bated breath, his eyes fixed on his mother's handwriting. Carefully, as if handling a sacred artifact, Chloe opened the seal. Inside was not one, but several folded sheets of paper. It was a letter. Her voice choked with emotion, she began to read aloud, Eleanor's words filling the silence of the hallway. "My dear Alfie, my little explorer, if you're reading this, it means our treasure hunt worked, and my heart is both broken and filled with pride." The letter was the final piece of the puzzle, the most painful and the most liberating. Eleanor explained, with brutal honesty and boundless love, her struggle with severe postnatal depression that had evolved into something darker and more terrifying after the death of her own father. She described her fear that she was not a good mother, her terror that her grief would somehow harm her son. She had not disappeared. She had made the hardest decision of her life. She had voluntarily checked herself into a long-term care facility in Scotland, a place where she could heal, leaving Alfie in the care of the system, where she knew he would be safe. "I did not abandon you, my love," Chloe read, tears now streaming freely down her face. "I left you so that I could save you from me. I created this map of our last perfect day together so that you would never doubt my love. Each object is a promise that I am with you in spirit. I wanted your last memory to be not of a sad goodbye, but of our greatest adventure. Be brave for both of us, my little one, and know that one day, when I am strong again, I will come back to you, with all the love in the universe, Mommy." The truth, in all its painful and beautiful complexity, was finally revealed. At his mother's words, the dam inside Alfie finally broke. He began to cry, not the silent shudders of panic, but loud, deep sobs full of pain, longing, and most of all, immense relief. The confusion that had haunted him, the terrible feeling of being discarded like the objects he had collected, all dissolved in the overwhelming certainty of his mother's love. He was not a lost boy. He was a loved boy, the hero of a treasure hunt created by the woman who loved him most in the world. He wept for everything he had lost, but also for everything he had just found: the truth. Arthur knelt down and for the first time hugged the boy tightly. Alfie didn't flinch. He clung to the old sweeper, his small body shaking with sobs, and wept into his shoulder. Meanwhile, Chloe opened the portfolio. Inside were not just technical drawings, but embroidery, tapestries, scraps of fabric. These were Eleanor's work. They were artistic representations of each stop on her last day. An embroidered guitar, a patterned fabric that mimicked the lines of the Merseyrail, a small carousel horse made of felt. Her art was also a map, a visual confirmation of the journey Alfie had reconstructed with his treasures. Arthur's role in the story was complete. He looked at the scene, the caretaker weeping silently over her artwork, the boy sobbing in her arms. He, the man who spent his days sweeping away what others considered worthless, had just helped find the most precious treasure in a child's life. He had not merely interpreted a map, he had helped restore a mother's last will, delivered her final message of love. He felt humbled and at the same time immense. His lifetime of silent observation, his memory for forgotten details, had all prepared him for this moment. Returning to the orphanage was a completely different story. They did not return with a found mother, but with a found truth which was just as powerful. Chloe presented the letter and portfolio to Mrs. Gable. The administrator, upon reading Eleanor's words, was speechless, her face pale with shame at her earlier misunderstanding. Alfie's story changed instantly. He was no longer the troubled boy who hoards trash. He was Alfie, Eleanor's beloved son, a boy dealing with grief in an unusually creative way. The map of objects previously seen as a symptom was carefully collected and stored in a special box, Alfie's treasure box. Eleanor's letter, with details of the clinic in Scotland, gave the orphanage authorities what they needed. They made contact. Eleanor was alive, weak, undergoing long treatment, but recovering and anxious to hear from her son. When she heard that Alfie had completed the treasure hunt and received her message, she wept with relief and found new strength to fight on. A video call was arranged, and for the first time in over a year, Alfie saw his mother's face on a screen. She looked tired, thinner, but her smile was the same, and upon seeing her, Alfie, his voice hoarse from disuse, whispered the first word he had said since the accident, "Mum." Alfie's transformation from that day on was remarkable. The silence that had enveloped him was no longer a fortress of fear, but a space of calm. He began to speak, first in short sentences, then in full conversations with Chloe and Arthur. He was still a quiet, observant boy, but the anxiety that had ruled him had dissipated, replaced by the certainty of his mother's love and the security of his new friends. He no longer needed objects to remember, because now he had words, and he began to use those words to tell his own stories, to describe the world as he saw it, a world full of details that, like Arthur, he now knew were important. Arthur became a permanent fixture in Alfie's life. The orphanage gave him a free pass, and he spent every afternoon after his shift with the boy. He was no longer just the sweeper, he was Grandpa Arthur. They no longer needed objects to communicate. They talked about everything, the different types of ships that came into the docks, the stories of Liverpool's buildings, the seagulls that stole chips from tourists. Arthur, the man who had spent his life watching other people's stories from afar, was now a main character in the most important story of all. He had found a family in the most unexpected place. 6 months later, on a sunny afternoon, Arthur and Alfie were sitting on a bench at the Albert Dock. Alfie was now speaking with increasing fluency, though he still preferred silent observation. He pointed to a seagull feather on the ground. "Look, Arthur, a feather," he said with a smile. Arthur smiled back. The feather, which might once have been the beginning of a sentence on a map, was now just a feather. It was a sign that Alfie no longer needed objects to anchor him. He had himself. He had the truth. And he had the promise of his mother's return. Their journey was not about finding a missing person in the physical sense, but about finding a lost truth. It was about proving that communication goes far beyond words. Alfie, on with his object language, taught the adults around him that you need to look beyond the surface, that you need to hear what is unsaid. He showed that the behavior the world labeled as problematic was, in fact, an incredibly complex and intelligent act of love and memory. His quiet resilience was a lesson to all who knew him. Chloe, the young carer, was also transformed by the experience. She learned from Arthur the importance of patient observation and radical empathy. She became Alfie's biggest advocate within the system, ensuring his needs were understood and respected. She understood that her job was not just to care for the children's physical well-being, but also to be a guardian of their stories, however strange or difficult to decipher. The unlikely alliance between her and the elderly street sweeper had created a circle of protection around Alfie that allowed him to flourish. The story of Alfie and Arthur spread quietly through the orphanage community. It became a kind of local legend, a reminder that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear a street sweeper's uniform and carry a broom. Arthur continued his daily work, sweeping the streets of Liverpool, but now he did it with a new sense of dignity. His knowledge of the city's discarded possessions was no longer a useless secret. It had become the tool that saved a child. He became living proof that every life and every knowledge, no matter how humble, has immense value. Eleanor's recovery, fueled by the news that Alfie had understood her message, was faster than the doctors had expected. Love was, after all, the most powerful medicine. Preparations for her return and her reunion with Alfie began. Their story, which had begun with tragic loss and profound silence, was moving toward a new beginning. A beginning built on truth, patience, and the extraordinary ability of an old man and a boy to create their own language from the wreckage of a life. One autumn afternoon, Arthur and Alfie sat on their favorite bench, watching the leaves fall. Alfie, who was now drawing in a notebook, showed Arthur his latest work. It was a map, but it was not a map of objects. It was a drawing of the square, with the orphanage, the cafe, the statue, and in the center, two figures, an old man with a broom and a little boy holding his hand. And at the top, he had written his first words on paper: Arthur and Alfie, home. Home was no longer a place his mother had disappeared from. It was the sense of security he had found with his unlikely friend. The true magic of a city like Liverpool, Arthur realized, is not in its famous stadiums or its legendary musical history. It is in the little stories that hide in its corners, in the treasures that are discarded as trash, in the unlikely connections between people that the city brings together. It is the story of how a city's trash became a boy's treasure map, how a mother's love could create a path through pain, and how an old street sweeper, by paying attention to the little things that everyone else overlooks, could sweep the sadness from a child's life and help him find his way back home. Alfie's journey teaches us that even in the darkest moments when we feel lost and voiceless, there are still ways to communicate, to keep our most precious memories alive. And Arthur's journey reminds us that wisdom lies not in titles or status, but in the ability to pay attention, to see value where no one else does, to hear the silence and understand its message. He didn't need a degree to be the best therapist Alfie could have. He just needed his heart and his listening eyes. This story is a tribute to all the silent guardians, to all the invisible people who, with their daily acts of kindness and observation, keep the world turning. It is a reminder that we should never underestimate the power of a small gesture or the significance of a forgotten object, because sometimes in a guitar pick, in a train ticket, in a rusty key, there is not just trash, but the map back to love, to truth, and to healing. And all we need is someone like Arthur to help us read it. He didn't seek recognition, he just wanted to understand a boy's silence. And in doing so, he ended up putting together the pieces of a lost memory and giving hope back to a family. Sometimes the world moves too fast, making us forget to look at the ground, at the small details we discard. But it is precisely in these forgotten fragments, in the trash that no one wants, that the most precious stories are hidden. It is there that we discover that no memory is truly lost if there is someone willing to look for it. If this story touched your heart, just like that of Arthur, Alfie, and Eleanor, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other journeys that remind us of what really matters. Seeing the treasure where everyone else only sees the trash.